Last 6 months have I come to appreciate how much I was largely unaware of. Back at the beginning of spring last year, I was coming out of a dark time that I had been stuck in for roughly 6 years. Long story short, I had a traumatic experience just before the birth of my daughter, and I lived through it for almost 6 months straight. The closest thing to a formal diagnosis I got from professionals was severe OCD plus anxiety. Some family members have said, looking back, that it seemed similar to CPTSD. Whatever it was then may not matter much for why I'm here now. Anyway, starting early last spring, after finding a great therapist a year prior, I started coming to the sense that I was no longer largely stuck in my head, just trying to hold down my government job and survive day to day with mental illness. As I started coming to, I began processing all the things I remembered happening while I was sick. Meanwhile, my wife's wedding ring broke twice in a very short time period, 3 times during our marriage. I also happened to find information about infidelity around this time, and as I started learning about the signs, I realized my wife's behavior was being described almost to the T. Early in the process, I remembered something that occurred several months prior involving a few strange bumps my wife complained about. It was at this point I started investigating, and I won't get into too many details because some of the things I did to get the information might be considered quite unethical. Anyway, to further condense things, I was very alarmed to learn that my wife liked hanging out at random houses around town for 2 to 3 hours at a time, usually after going shopping or to the nail salon or getting her hair done. I later determined that at least 2 of these places were VRBOs. As I discovered this, I found some messages she had exchanged with a family friend, a person I've known since high school, and, go figure, was also my best man at our wedding. Needless to say, the messages were very flirty and had been deleted days after I discovered them. At this point, I dug further and started putting together more memories I had of their interactions. As the days wore on, I came to the conclusion that my wife certainly had an affair, most likely with my best man. I can't be certain how long the affair lasted, but the hot message block that was wiped was 6 months' worth. Other things I found, and going by my own memory, I concluded the affair lasted at least 6 months, and could have even started prior to me getting sick, by 6 to 10 months, as long as 7 years. During that time, I did a secret paternity test, which I'm pretty sure my wife found out about by going through my emails, as someone logged in at a time when I wasn't home. Around this time, she started saying things like, "You know she's your kid, right?" Anyway, the test indicated she was in fact my child. Phew. Once the test came back, I decided it was best to try to repair my marriage, as it appeared the affair my wife had been having ended several months prior, and I'd already noticed a change in her behavior indicating the affair was likely over. Fast forward several months of us working on things, and after an anniversary vacation trip, she said she had not felt this good about our relationship since we got engaged, which in her mind had been the pinnacle of our relationship. While I was rather elated to hear this, I couldn't help but feel that voice in my head saying, "But wait, what about when we got married?" But for some reason, she didn't think that was the best part of our relationship. Up to this point, I'd only expressed concern about her faithfulness once, about 7 weeks prior to the trip, and she gaslit the living shit out of me. At that stage in the process, I was like a deer in headlights and totally botched the process. When I realized how in over my head I was, I pretended she had convinced me that I was just crazy and needed to see my therapist. I convinced her to go with me to the therapist, and wow, did she seem very uncomfortable sitting there. I could totally see her storming out of that place, screaming expletives, and the entire thing ending very badly. So, as we dug into things, I went with the narrative that my concerns were mostly driven by just the broken rings and lack of sleep. At any rate, things seemed to be going pretty well up until a few weeks after our trip. Throughout this time, I'd been absorbing and analyzing everything my wife said, trying to make sense of the new reality I found myself in. During the trip, I remember her mentioning that if we ever broke up, She could totally see herself reaching out for an occasional booty call, assuming I had not cheated on her. At this point, I decided to ask her how being with someone else at that point might affect her opinion on engaging in that activity, and her reply indicated she'd still be open to considering the idea. I considered this significant, as when we first got together, she would talk about how much she utterly hated cheaters and would never think of cheating. Fast forward to a few weeks after the trip, and things are going well, but it bothers me every time my wife tells me something I know is a lie in light of what I've learned. I actually want her to feel like she doesn't have to keep lying to me, and that I've essentially decided to forgive her for the transgressions that occurred while I was sick. So one day, I decided to compassionately confront her about what I'd learned over the last few months. I compassionately confront my wife with my concerns after things seem to be going much better, and much to my surprise, she goes totally and utterly ballistic, gaslighting to the extreme, and obviously lying. She was so hysterical during it all, I was stuck like a deer in headlights again. I remember how during all this, she did 4 of the 5 things people typically do when they are lying, according to a law enforcement video I watched about how to tell if someone was lying. The thing that blew me away the most was the sheer level of hostility she was conveying. I remember once when we were dating, my sister took a crappy photo of my wife supposedly flirting with some random dude, and when I confronted her about it, she denied it was her, but did so with grace, compassion, and empathy. The other thing that shocked me during her outburst was she actually said I was only her husband and not her friend, and that maybe she should just go out, and if she talks to someone, she talks to someone. It seemed clear to me what was being insinuated here, and given how great things had been only weeks ago, I was too shocked and blown away to be able to articulate an appropriate reaction. At this point, given this and other things she had been saying here and there, it seemed as if the wife I knew when we got married was no more. And now I have the same wife with a different set of values. I will say, given what she has told me about some of the dreams she has had and things she has said, it's like she has the bad girl alter ego split ID thing going on in there. After the big blow-up, my wife did the total emotional withdrawal bit unless my daughter was present, and this went on for several days. Afterward, she claimed the reason for the blow-up was mainly due to an answer I gave to one of the couple's questions a day earlier, but I really don't buy that at all. At any rate, thus far, besides the occasional lie that crops up, everything seems to be going pretty well. I can't say I've noticed much that would lead me to suspect my wife is currently having an affair, but I do wonder how much longer it will be before the next shoe drops. One of the challenging and disheartening aspects of this ordeal is the utter lack of resources geared towards someone going through this while also dealing with mental illness. Most of what I have found regarding mental illness and affairs is geared toward a betrayed spouse who has a wayward spouse that is mentally ill, but not the other way around. While I'm sure some people might not think it would make that much of a difference, I can tell you that in my situation, it does. I feel like this could be a factor preventing my wife from coming clean, or at least admitting that it happened, which would be huge for me. Beyond that, the only other 3 things I'd really want to know are why, the start date, and what was said about me behind my back. At this point, I've learned more about relationships in the last 6 months than I have during the rest of my entire life, and then some. Looking back at everything, ignorance when it comes to relationships is not bliss. Ignorance is the highway to hell. I realized there were issues early on, even when dating. Apparently, being a knight in shining armor does not bode well for love. Up until a couple of months ago, that's how my wife would describe me when she remembered me from our dating years. If only I had known then, I could have bailed easily. Now I feel like I'm kinda stuck in this strange, mildly intimidating new reality. Things look relatively good on the surface at the moment, but I can't help but feel like the status quo is not stable long-term. At this point, I'm leaning toward continuing attempting reconciliation, and will probably continue down this path for at least the short term. Not only have I already put quite a bit of effort into this path already, but I have not put myself in an ideal position for the war path. In fact, I'd stand to lose a lot on that path and don't see myself choosing that option unless I discover my wife has restarted her previous affair or a new one, or the situation notably worsens in some other way. The two main problems with the war path are as follows. 1. 70% of my wealth is tied up in my home. My wife contributed nothing to its purchase, but the laws in my state mean she owns 50% of it. In the event of divorce, I stand to lose a lot more financially than she does. 2. I was in bad shape mentally for years, and unfortunately, some of the so-called professionals' help I got during this time was anything but. One of the individuals I went to gave me poisonous drugs and recommended I be institutionalized, and I expect this would come up in court if I try to get divorced, complicating any war effort. The biggest concern I have going forward is that something about this situation just feels unstable and unsustainable long-term. After spending months letting my OCD work for me instead of against me, I've probably read more about relationships and affairs in the last 6 months than some people do in an entire lifetime. As I mentioned in my previous post, one area I couldn't find much information on was how being a betrayed spouse that has had or is having trouble with mental illness impacts the recovery process for both betrayed spouse and wayward spouse. This brings me to why I ultimately came here. My hope is that some people here might either have first-hand experience with such a situation, or maybe know someone that did go through this in the way I did, in the hope I can get a bit better idea of what to expect next. Update. Okay, so I've gotten a rough overview of the 180, and I've kind of drifted more towards that direction by default, given I've run through most of the relationship rescue stuff I read about and have started to spend some of the time I'd been spending doing that, preparing for the possibility that things will go south at some point down the road. By preparing, I mean taking stock of my strengths and weaknesses and doing the same for my wife's, in the event the situation starts deteriorating, which I'm assuming will likely play out as her restarting the previous affair or starting a new one. Should that happen, I've decided I'd go with a plan that has similarities to 180 but is a bit more aggressive, and I've come to refer to it as Mino Protocol. Now, what I'm currently hoping for is that over the course of the next year or so, as my wife realizes I'm not going to relapse, she might begin to open up a bit more about what happened. Thus far, the closest I've gotten from my wife as far as confessions go is a response to me telling her there are not to be any more mulligans in the marriage going forward. Her reply was, "No more hanky-panky," at which point I clearly said no. At any rate, my wife's treatment towards me has improved markedly compared to how she had been treating me during the affair. The few times this wasn't the case was when I directly inquired about the affair, the discovery process of which I botched pretty badly, likely contributing to the situation I'm in now. My wife has put some effort into the marriage since the affair ended. She's insisted on the family eating dinner together during the week with no TV. She has also started going to the church that her bestie, Wing Girl, and her husband started going to shortly after the affair ended, and has encouraged me to take part and go with her. My wife has also stopped guarding her phone and leaves it around unattended frequently. My wife has also been leaving her Facebook account logged in on the family PC and Gmail account as well. My wife hardly ever goes out anymore and is certainly easier to get a hold of when she does compared to when she was having the affair. She has also started becoming more affectionate both in public and private compared to how she was during the affair. Now, what I'm not sure about is how much of this change is driven by me having recovered and being able to function better socially and to some extent more generally, or if this change in behavior is more attributable to the affair having ended. I will say if I had known what I know now at the start of this ordeal, the present situation would likely be drastically different. Most likely, I would have either gotten my wife to get professional assistance in becoming a person that isn't broken, since that's clearly what she was, and most certainly still is, or the marriage would have ended. I do think that given what I know about her and her affair partner, them taking a shot at a serious long-term relationship or marriage and having it actually go anywhere was not very likely. In fact, I suspect part of the reason things fell apart there is they were not on the same page as far as going for something along those lines. Having said that, I don't feel I'm competing with the affair partner and don't think I ever was. Well, not knowingly anyway. I also say I take a limited sense of satisfaction in knowing it turned out that way without me actively doing anything to undermine it. I really feel at this point I've been doing what I can to make the marriage more appealing and entertaining, reducing the chance of a future affair. If the future affair does come to pass, I'll be far more prepared to confront it than I had been previously. I can also say I think it's far less likely I'd botch D2 like I did D1, which would be helpful for me in convincing my limited support network to lend aid should things take a turn for the worse, and I end up in an exceedingly nasty divorce. Okay, I'd like to start by saying I fully understand that my wife has issues that make it harder for her to resist engaging in destructive behaviors. I also fully understand that at some point she made a conscious decision to do something that she knew was wrong and continued engaging in that behavior for an extended period of time. Now, having said that, I can't just accept that there's absolutely nothing that I could have done to prevent myself from finding myself in the situation I currently find myself in. Looking back at when I first started dating my wife, there were huge red flags that I totally missed. I still remember when we first started dating, she would say to me how she couldn't understand why I was dating her and why someone like myself would choose her. At that time in my life, and even up until rather recently, I was a very ignorant person when it comes to relationships, so at the time, I viewed her remarks as an odd type of compliment rather than the huge red flag I've come to realize it was. There were some other red flags that I missed as well, but that one was the one that clearly indicated she had some real issues. As you can probably guess, I've gone back through the history of our relationship with all this newfound knowledge I've acquired and taken note of things like I mentioned above. In light of all that, it's hard for me to fathom that I'd still be in the position I'm in now if I wasn't so ignorant back when I was dating my wife. I'm inclined to think that if I knew about red flags back then, she would have never become my wife in the first place and would likely be someone else's wayward wife. I also take some level of comfort knowing that if the worst comes to pass and my marriage fails, I'll be far less likely to end up with another broken person. Update. So far, things seem to be going pretty well overall, at least as far as my wife not going back to or starting another affair. Some of my wife's other more problematic behaviors also seem to continue improving, and she displays more appreciation toward me, complimenting me way more often than she did when she was having her affair. The only thing that seems off is the physical intimacy, and I only say that because there were times while the affair was in progress that it seemed things were better in this regard. Also, for a short period after the affair, things seemed really good, for maybe a week and a half. The most troubling part of this is I don't really know how significant this is in the overall scheme of things. I'm not sure if this is going to be the new normal or if this is just another stage of the post-affair process that will be a memory a year down the road. I just wish the only version of normal I can use as a reference point was prior to when I started having issues, which was over 7 years ago now. At any rate, I've been continuing to prepare for the possibility things could go south again, while also taking some measures to hopefully reduce the chance of that happening as well. Sadly, I'm rather limited in what I can do about my apartment, given the laws in my state and how it's presently owned free and clear, so hopefully things don't go sideways to such an extent that divorce becomes the only option. I have been working on making myself more attractive to my wife, and verbally, she has indicated I'm making progress in that regard. Now, why that, along with the confidence it brings, doesn't seem to have helped heat things up otherwise, is a bit beyond me. Heck, in some ways, I'd say I'm actually better than I was in every regard just before I got sick so many years ago. I can also say, without any question, that I have the former AP beat in every metric besides star sign and Myers-Briggs type compatibility with my wayward spouse. I'm just hoping that a year from now I'll be able to look back and say what initially seemed like a situation with a very bleak outlook in terms of reconciliation was able to be turned around. On another positive side note, I've also noticed the former AP's name mentioned less frequently as time has gone on, so I'm assuming this means the affair partner is not on my wayward spouse's mind as much as when the ordeal started. The actions I'm taking are as much about putting me in a better position to move on as they are to try to make me more attractive to my wife. My wife is also telling people how much better I'm doing, which isn't going to garner any sympathy for her if she strays again. My support network will also be more inclined to help me hire a divorce attorney whose heart flutters when he hears Lestat's sonata if my wife strays again after how good things have gotten. As you might have guessed, some of the people I'll be glad to have helping me when things go bad had marriages that survived infidelity, and so I'm kind of expected to put an honest, good faith effort into fixing things as best I can. I can honestly say at this point I have done that. I'll also add that my wayward spouse probably knows the affair partner can't really, and probably doesn't want to, try to replace me. If my wife does mess up with him again, I'll definitely be leveraging that knowledge when I go from the carrot to the stick method of addressing issues. At this point, I've already backed off many of the things I did earlier on with the sole focus on saving the marriage. Working on myself does hopefully make my wife look at me and the marriage in a more positive light, but that is far from my only reason for doing these things. The way I see it, if my marriage fails, the things I'm doing now will also help me get re-established later on. I've generally come to the conclusion at this point that I'll probably never get anything even remotely approaching full disclosure. Granted, I'd really like to just know the start date, end date, why, and what was said about me behind my back. Sadly, I think due to what is likely the very scandalous and shameful nature of the affair, this won't happen. There are also a host of other factors that are probably working against disclosure, including but not necessarily limited to the following: trust issues between me and my wife predating D-Day, and probably the affair as well, the involvement of other parties in the affair, deep-seated resentments likely tied into making the affair more likely to happen in the first place, the risk of job loss due to disclosure of the affair, my wife generally not being the best at dealing with and expressing emotions in a constructive manner, neither of us has a secure attachment type, and my mental health history, which could probably also be added as something that would probably discourage disclosure. I also, at one point, shortly after D-Day, got into a conversation with my wife about what it might be like if one day we won the lottery or got an inheritance, etc. During this conversation, I brought up how in such situations people can appear out of the woodworks trying to obtain some of your new bling. We spent a short while on the subject before I threw in what might happen if one of us was ever blackmailed. And yes, she actually said, "You mean like if I cheated?" I was frankly a bit amazed she said that, and also rather troubled by her saying it. A week or two later, I determined she visited a website regarding sex extortion. Hopefully this area of concern is just emotions and anxiety versus substance, but given a few things my wife had mentioned the OM said a few times, I couldn't rule this issue out entirely unless my wife actually came clean and elaborated on things. Right now, I'm contemplating how to force the issue of the affair back to the forefront without asking about it directly, and hoping to be able to get more information than I had previously. At this point, another D-Day wouldn't necessarily be the worst outcome, assuming it happens within the next year or so. I'd consider the worst outcome to be one where the marriage hobbles along in what still feels like a state of disrepair for many years, whether or not another D-Day came with it far down the line. As it stands, I'm getting a little concerned because it feels like what had been mostly slow progress is now transitioning to stagnation. As for pushing more 180, I suppose if stagnation appears to be prevailing, I could push more on that front. Even though I can't help but think she would just be more inclined to engage in affair activities again if I pull away even more, as my wife is kind of a needy person.